Hey everybody, you're watching 5-Minute Web Dev, and this is another episode in our series, 5-Minute JavaScript. Today's topic is let and const variables. If you haven't seen my video, Variables in JavaScript, go check that out right now before you watch this one, because that video covers a lot of aspects of let and const variables. And I'm going to use this video to mainly point out how they differ from regular var variables. Let's begin. Let and const are two new keywords we can use to declare variables in ES6. Variables declared with these keywords have some different behavior than regular variables. The biggest and most important difference between let and const variables and regular variables is that let and const are block scoped, not function scoped. So when you declare a let or const variable, that variable gets scoped to the block of code in which it is declared and not to the function in which it is written. In other words, curly braces, since they create blocks, are the delimiters of scope when it comes to let and const, not functions. So if you have a let or const variable within the first block of an if statement in a function, that variable will be scoped to that if statement and will only be accessible within that if statement. It will not be accessible to the rest of the function. In fact, it won't even be accessible to the else block in that if statement. It's only scoped to that block. This is important and awesome for a few reasons. In general, the more limited the scope of your variables can be, the easier your code will be to reason about and maintain. This is one reason why we know that writing global variables is a bad practice in most cases. If a portion of your code base doesn't need to access a variable, why give it access? It simply complicates things and can cause some very hard to debug errors. Well, with let and const, we can apply the same thinking at a more atomic level. Now, when we write functions, if a certain portion of our function doesn't need access to a variable, we can make sure it doesn't have it. Another big difference between let const variables and regular variables is their behavior in regards to hoisting. If you need a refresher on the topic, go check out my other video on it and come back here to finish up. Contrary to what you might hear some people say, let and const are still hoisted. Their behavior is just different. Check out this example. If this were a var variable, the code would run and it would log out undefined. This seems odd, but it's the way hoisting works with regular variables. However, since it is a let variable, this code will throw a reference error. Because of this, many people oversimplify the issue and say that let and const are not hoisted. But here's the truth. Technically, they are hoisted. They just have this thing applied to them called the temporal dead zone. Basically, this means that these variables will throw reference errors if you try to access them before they are initialized. Here's an example that shows that they're indeed hoisted. If let wasn't hoisted, then the console would log our outer variable's value because we're using the same name. Instead, we get a reference error again. According to the ES6 specification, let const variables are actually stored in memory before any of the code in their scope are run. Remember, that's hoisting. But they can't be accessed in the code before they are declared. This is where they differ from var variables. var variables are initialized by the JavaScript engine with the value undefined during the compile phase. This doesn't happen for let and const until the execution phase evaluates their declaration, so you can't access them before then. In other words, you can't use let and const variables physically in your code before the line in which they are declared or initialized. This space where they can't be accessed is the temporal dead zone. I plan on doing another video that fleshes out the temporal dead zone in greater detail in the future, but for now, this should be enough to have a decent understanding in regards to let and const. Now, here's why this is important. This behavior makes way more sense. In my opinion, the way let and const are handled in regards to hoisting is so much more intuitive than the way var is handled. In my previous example, I tried to reference the variable before it was declared, and it gave me an error. This is a huge safeguard, as referencing variables before they're declared is rarely ever intentional. In fact, and I said this in my video on hoisting, I believe it's a bad practice that just leads to confusing code and should be avoided. Using let and const turns this rule into something that the JavaScript engine actually enforces. As a quick note, if you're using a transpiler like Babel, you might actually need to turn on the temporal dead zone option for this behavior to work the way it's intended to. So we've talked about let and const together, but I want to focus on const now by itself. Const is special because it creates a constant variable. Its value cannot be reassigned and it can't be redeclared. Now, this doesn't mean that the value of that variable is immutable or can't change. For instance, you can still add properties to an object assigned to a const variable, but you cannot point the const variable on anything else other than that object. Because of these rules, you have to assign to a const variable immediately. You can't do this. You must do this. You also can't redeclare it in the same scope. In my opinion, const should be the replacement for var whenever possible. Oftentimes, we don't plan on reassigning our variables, just performing actions on them or using them for something. If this is the case, use const. If you know you'll need to reassign the variable at some point, use let. If you use this practice, you'll know when you read your code later that your const variables will never be reassigned, that's enforced, and that your let variables will be reassigned at some point. They can serve as signals to the reader that make your code easier to understand. Lots of people are completely doing away with var now that let and const are available. I won't state this as a hard and fast rule, but I think it's a pretty good idea based on the benefits noted above. So, in summary, let and const are in many ways just like var, but they differ in that they are block scoped and not function scoped, and using them in your code before they're declared will result in a reference error instead of just returning the value undefined. Const is even more different in that it creates a variable in its scope that cannot be reassigned. In my opinion, let and const help us write JavaScript that is easier to understand and easier to reason about. Now, go and put them to use. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for watching 5-Minute Web Dev. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what other topics you'd like me to cover in the future. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next time.